Min Aung Hlaing has bet in his entire tenure as commander-in-chief on the Russia relationship.
Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Thursday, May 15, and today, on episode 27, we're speaking about Russia with Richard Horsey, Senior Myanmar Advisor at the International Crisis Group. But before that, let's quickly cover just some of the most egregious atrocities inflicted on civilians by the Myanmar military over the past week, during its supposed continuing unilateral ceasefire after the March 28 earthquake. So it's been a particularly devastating 7 days for civilians in Myanmar, with the Air Force dropping dozens of bombs right across the country. Airstrikes have continued to apply pressure to the Ta'ang National Liberation Army in its positions between Mandalay and northern Shan State, with civilian deaths and injuries. These attacks are paving the way for the Myanmar military's expected ground offensive to retake the road up from Punalwin from the Ta'ang resistance group. But the other strikes around the country seem more intent on terrorising rather than strategically weakening resistance groups. Last weekend, the military killed at least 24 civilians in airstrikes in Sagaing region's Wutlet and Chang'u townships and in Mandalay's Singu township. Then on Monday, cluster bombs hit a resistance school in Sagaing's Dabayin township, killing more than 20 children and 2 teachers. Over 40 people were also injured. The military's State Administration Council, SAC, publicly claimed the reports were fake news, even though there were many testimonials and photos of the location, the dead and the injured published by independent media. This was followed by another major airstrike in Rakhine State's Rathadown township, in a village just a few kilometres outside the main town controlled by the Arakan army. That airstrike killed 13 civilians, including several children, and injured more than 20. If you add up all these casualties, and then include the civilians killed by ground operations this week, the death toll is close to 70. That's an average of at least 10 civilians dead every day at the hands of the Myanmar military. While these horrors were unfolding, coup leader Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and his wife, Juju Hla, visited Moscow in Russia over last weekend to attend Russia's commemoration of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany 80 years ago. They were accompanied by the SAC's Foreign Minister, Than Swe, Defense Minister, Meng Meng-e, and others. Min Aung Hlaing met with China's President Xi Jinping, telling the leader that he would increase cooperation with China and protect Chinese projects and personnel. Min Aung Hlaing also met with Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev during the visit, which was his second to Russia this year, if you recall from episode 18 of this podcast in early March. Now to unpack the deepening friendship between Myanmar and Russia and the opportunities Min Aung Hlaing is receiving from his dictator bromance with Vladimir Putin, let's bring in our special guest. Hi, Richard. Thanks for joining. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Luke. It's great to be on the program.
Okay, let's get into it. Russia quickly acknowledged Min Aung Hlaing's 2021 coup. Many other countries didn't, and the senior general has been to Russia several times since then, though he didn't have his first official meeting with Vladimir Putin until March of this year. In that trip, and the most recent one, he really seemed jubilant to be on Russian soil. So I want to ask you first about Min Aung Hlaing. He's also been to Thailand twice this year, and he's been recognised as the leader of the country by more heads of state this year than any time since the coup. Now that's thanks really to the 28 March Sagaing earthquake, I think. But notwithstanding that tragedy and the military's continued defeats on the battlefield, do you think that the first half of this year is actually shaping up to be Min Aung Hlaing's best since the coup?
So I think, yes, diplomatically, Min Aung Hlaing this year has been feeling like the wind is blowing in his favour. And that relates both to greater diplomatic engagement with him and his regime, but also, of course, what's happening in Washington. And you have now a White House that is not promoting democracy overseas, that is not looking to support his opponents. His opponents are precisely the kind of people that this Trump White House has cast a lot of doubt and skepticism towards, right? Overseas democracy promotion, all these kinds of things. And so I think the end of USAID, the end of democracy promotion overseas, has taken a lot of money away from the regime's political opponents. But also, I think it means that Washington is no longer this kind of beacon that many in Myanmar look to. The NUG and others maybe no longer feel that they have the support of the most powerful country in the world. And I think that's important from a psychological as well as a practical position. So, on that side of the equation, he feels like the US is less of a determined adversary. On the other side, he's had this fantastic red carpet treatment from Putin, the literal embrace in Moscow, a real recognition as head of state, and really the first time that Min Aung Hlaing has been, fully accorded that status in Moscow or more or less anywhere else. He followed up with a visit to Minsk to see Lukashenko, and he returned to Myanmar, I think, quite buoyant after this trip, and then the earthquake hit. And that obviously was took a lot of the spring out of his step. It was a terrible tragedy, but for the regime in particular, a lot of the damage, a lot of the impact was in Naypyidaw, on its administrative buildings, on the military quarter, and then from a more astrological perspective, there's a history in Myanmar of seeing natural disasters as kind of cosmic comments on the quality of the leadership of the day. And as a very superstitious person himself, Min Aung Hlaing won't have avoided the conclusion that this will be regarded in Myanmar, including by many in the upper echelons of the Naypyidaw elite, as some sort of commentary on Min Aung Hlaing's leadership. And we shouldn't forget in that regard that he isn't universally liked and applauded as a leader. Far from it. Even within his own circles, he's seen as a weak leader, a micromanaging leader, an uninspiring leader, a leader who is not providing a kind of strategic vision for the future. The other military officers, the other elite in Naypyidaw, aren't all sitting around thanking their lucky stars that they have a leader like Min Aung Hlaing. They're rather thanking their lucky stars that it's at least him and not them who are holding the poison chalice. So this was, I think, a moment where Min Aung Hlaing's exuberance on his return from Moscow and Minsk was muted. But then the earthquake also gave cover to other political leaders in the region to directly reach out, to meet with him. You had visits from ASEAN foreign ministers to Myanmar to inspect the earthquake damage. You had the BIMSTEC meeting in Bangkok with other regional leaders. That was already scheduled. He was already invited. That would have happened anyway. But I think the earthquake gave cover to those leaders to have those bilateral meetings, and all of them did so. So, all of that was quite welcome. And then a few days later, he was back in Bangkok again to meet with Malaysian leader Anwar, the current chair of ASEAN, and Thaksin. And so I think, he feels probably now that the period initially after the coup of extreme diplomatic isolation, where even Moscow was still willing to have him visit, but only willing to have him there at the level of an army chief. They didn't recognize him as head of government or head of state. That's why he hasn't had a bilateral meeting with Putin before now. But I think he feels like that extreme isolation period is now over, and that gradually he's getting more diplomatic engagement, more traction, and that things are looking up. Whether that's an accurate reading or not, that's certainly how it looks, I think, from Naypyidaw.
Okay, and you led there with your response the Trump administration's changes, right, in the US. So has that also affected the Russia side of the equation here?
Yes, it's also had an effect on Putin as well. Trump's kind of pivot to Putin has allowed him to feel that he's much less besieged, has given Putin a lot more confidence. And that's also given him the capability to be much more adventurous, I think, in his foreign policy approaches to things, given him more bandwidth to pick up issues like Myanmar. I mean, I'm not sure that bilateral visit to Moscow would have gone exactly the same way in a world where Putin was facing, a stridently opposed Washington, and where the Ukraine war wasn't going as well for Moscow as it currently is. And so, that change in Washington has reverberated around the world, and I think it has certainly had an impact on the extent to which Russia and the regime in Myanmar have been able to upgrade their relationship and do more with what was previously a kind of purely aspirational relationship.
Thinking about this relationship, Richard, how one-sided is it? How reliant is the SAC on Russia in the current environment, conflict and political environment? And what does Russia really get from supporting the SAC?
I think that's a really interesting question. These two countries have been allies for some time, but they really found themselves in the dark days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and after the Myanmar military's coup. And they were both isolated, heavily sanctioned. And I think that gave greater import to the bilateral relationship for both sides, because previously it had been mainly defined as an arms purchase arrangement, right? Myanmar was a good customer for Russian weapons systems. It didn't go much beyond that. Min Aung Hlaing, I think, has a soft spot for Russia. I think he feels comfortable there. His annual pilgrimages are more than just the normal processes of diplomatic engagement with an ally. I think it's really somewhere where he feels he can go, he won't be judged, he enjoys being, and there's not many countries in the world where he can go for a kind of break and so on. So I think he likes being in Russia. I think the relationship between him and former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu was a warm one. Min Aung Hlaing has bet in his entire tenure as commander-in-chief on the Russia relationship. He pivoted his arms purchasing, especially for high-tech weapon systems, away from China and to Russia. That's partly because he felt that Myanmar was over-reliant on Chinese equipment. And, you don't want to be over-reliant on a giant neighbor's equipment because they can switch it off. It's not a good situation to be in, right? So he wanted to diversify the sources of Myanmar's weapon systems. Russia seemed like a very good bet. It was reasonably priced, high-tech equipment. And he also sent thousands of Myanmar trainees to Russia for military technical training, but also for training in Russian universities. So there are now 7,000 or 8,000 Myanmar graduates of technology institutes and universities in Russia over the last 20 years. So he's been betting on this relationship for some time as a strategic hedge against China. But it's only in the last few years that it's been possible to put more meat on the bones of that relationship. That is, Russia wants something now as well. In the early days post-Ukraine invasion, what Russia wanted was arms supplies, right? It was desperate for munitions because it had been selling Russian equipment to Myanmar for some time. The Myanmar defense industries makes artillery shells, other munitions in Russian caliber. And we know that some of those Myanmar manufactured munitions have turned up on battlefields in Ukraine. We have reports from Ukraine intelligence to that effect. But also, Russia repurchased a lot of military equipment that it had sold to arms purchasers in the region. We don't know exactly who, but we can imagine that India and Vietnam are the two largest purchasers of Russian equipment in the region. And so there are credible reports of equipment being transshipped through Myanmar from unknown sources back to Moscow for use in Ukraine. Things like tank barrels, advanced optics on tanks, the kinds of things that Russia would need to convert some of its older equipment in storage and in museums and so on into something that can be used on the battlefield. So it's limited, but it's something that Myanmar is useful for. Whereas for Myanmar, I think there was a great deal of excitement in the regime, of hope, of aspiration, that this Russia relationship could really save them, could really dig them out of a hole, could really be transformative in the political landscape that they faced and military landscape that they faced. That hasn't really come to pass. Russia has been too preoccupied with events on its western flank in Ukraine, its relationship with Europe, and so on, to devote any real significant attention to Myanmar. This is not a moment where Putin is going to be acting out his dreams to be a Pacific power. Right? He's focused on the European theater, and also Russia is hamstrung. One of the things I think that the regime probably hoped that Russia could help with was in the Credentials Committee at the UN in New York. Russia could be very helpful in pushing for the regime representative to be seated, challenging Jo Motun's credentials in the Credentials Committee, and vetoing Security Council resolutions, such as the one that passed, the first ever on Myanmar, in December 2022. But the reality is that Russia does not have freedom of action on Myanmar in the Security Council. China has made very clear that it sees Myanmar as its backyard and that it expects Moscow to follow whatever policy line that Beijing takes in New York. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its relationship with China has become absolutely vital. And so it is not the moment when Russia would think about testing the limits of that relationship, especially on an issue like Myanmar, which is not core to Russia's interests. And that's why when Beijing abstained on that December 2022 resolution, Russia abstained also. So Russia is not of great help at the UN in New York. Russia isn't that helpful strategically. Not much has come from this other than diplomatic engagement, the warm, fuzzy feeling that I'm sure Min Aung Hlaing gets when he manages to travel to a foreign country or a more advanced country and is feted and greeted as a leader, which he would not be in most other places in the world.
Good. Thank you for bringing up the context there of Russia and China together. These two are the RCC's main benefactors. But Russia and China themselves have sort of undergone a big shift in their relative balance of power with each other, in the second half of the 20th century, but really dramatically so recently after the Ukraine invasion. Russia now needs China's friendship and goodwill more than ever, and China has more leverage now over Russia. So how do Russia-China relations impact Myanmar beyond the United Nations, which you mentioned already? There's also reports that Russia exports oil to China through Jiaopu, for example.
Yes, I think a significant amount of the oil that's been going through the oil pipeline from Jiaopu to Kunming is Urals crude. It's crude that is sanctioned internationally and which Russia is selling at a discount to China. So that's also important. Again, it's not crucial for China's energy security. This is a relatively small percentage of China's crude imports, but it's quite important for Russia to have significant purchases of its oil. Of course. So Myanmar is somewhat of a peripheral issue for both Russia and China, but it's not an completely unimportant one. And so that relationship between Russia and China is really important. The reason that that Myanmar turns to Russia for military equipment, it's kind of random, right? After the Slork regime came to power in 1988, it became very dependent on China and particularly Chinese weapons to keep it in power. That wasn't its first choice. And I think if in that period, late 1980s, early 1990s, the Soviet Union had not been imploding, then it might have seen an opportunity there. And the Myanmar regime may have seen the advantage of weapons deals with Moscow rather than with Beijing. But as it was, the chaos in the imploding Soviet Union meant that was not an option, and China was really the only option. And so for a decade, Myanmar relied on China for almost all of its weapons purchases. But it knew the risks. And in 2011, when Min Aung Hlaing became commander-in-chief, he set about pivoting to Russia at that point. So it was late in the day, and Myanmar was already kind of embedded with Chinese systems. Now, China was not happy about this, right? And China still is not happy about it. And so there are also limits on how much Russia has a free hand in those weapons deals, in commercial deals, without kind of upsetting China as well. So that relationship is very important, I think, in terms of how much space the regime has.
And then bringing this all together, Min Aung Hlaing finally met President Xi Jinping in Russia last week. That's the first time since the 2021 coup. They met on the sidelines the same way that Min Aung Hlaing first met Putin after the coup in Vladivostok, before he was later accorded with his full honours on that bilateral visit. So is it going to go the same way with China? Are relations between the Chinese Communist Party and the SAC now warming up?
I think warm is maybe the wrong way of thinking about it. All of the doubts that China had at the time of the coup and afterwards, they have not been resolved, right? China still thinks the coup was a terrible mistake. It thinks it was one that deeply impacted China and China's business investments in the country, its strategic investments in the China-Myanmar economic corridor. It doesn't like dealing with this military regime, and it doesn't like Min Aung Hlaing. It thinks that he's an incompetent leader and someone who harbors well-known anti-Chinese sentiment. So none of that has gone away. Beijing hasn't so much warmed up to the regime as it has recognized that regime collapse would not be in Beijing's interest. In other words, a power vacuum in Naypyidaw, Beijing feels would be worse than the persistence of this weak military regime. So it hasn't stepped in to save the regime. It's stepped in to prevent it failing completely and collapsing. And that's a very different thing. And we see this from the fact that China's engagement with the regime has been quite reluctant at every stage, right? It did belatedly invite Min Aung Hlaing to China, something he'd been lobbying for a long time last year, but it was only to a regional meeting in Kunming, not the bilateral visit that he'd been seeking. And he didn't get a meeting with Xi Jinping, who wasn't there. He met only with the Chinese premier. And even now, this meeting with Xi Jinping, it's been on the sidelines of another event. It hasn't been a specific invitation to Min Aung Hlaing. So it is a step forward in terms of the relationship, but we shouldn't overestimate what it means. China is not fully renormalizing relations with this regime. I think China's been pushing very hard for elections. We can talk about why it thinks they're a good idea, if you like. But anyway, it does think that they're a better idea than no elections. And I think that China will not rush to fully renormalize relations with Naypyidaw until after those elections. And then perhaps a renormalization could be quite fast, because there is lots of things that China wants to get done in Myanmar, and that requires a kind of normal, full diplomatic relationship. But that's not what it's been doing up till now. It's been stepping in to prevent a disorderly collapse of the regime rather than to embrace the regime.
Well, now that you've said the E word, the SAC is still talking about those elections, mentioning them several times since the earthquake. We've had 4 years to mull over these proposals now, and the common wisdom has become that China supports the military's elections because it wants to see Min Aung Hlaing's power diluted within the SAC. Is that how you see it?
I think that's right. I think it's not that Beijing has any great attachment, as we know, to public consultation and electoral democracy, right? This isn't about the democracy or public consultation part of elections. It's about what they represent in constitutional terms. And China expects that elections will dilute Min Aung Hlaing's power because, according to the constitution, in principle, he should have to choose between being the commander-in-chief and being the president. And so it opens up the possibility that others will come to the fore, people that Beijing feels are more competent or they're more comfortable working with. But also, I think there is an inherent distaste among the Communist Party for engaging with a kind of military regime. I think they would prefer to deal with a constitutional government, and that's not about concern over human rights abuses or other such niceties. It's about is this an administration that fits with the domestic rules of the game? Is it adhering to the domestic rules of the game, whatever they are? Because that's important for stability, for continuity, for deals that Beijing may want to do with Naypyidaw sticking. And of course, Beijing has not that long ago had some quite significant experience with deals that it did not sticking. And I'm thinking, of course, about the Myitsone Dam that was suspended by President Thein Sein when China thought it had a full green light and go ahead. And that came as a huge shock. So China prefers dealing with a kind of constitutional, orderly power rather than one that has flagrantly violated the domestic rules of the game.
Taking a moment out to ask you, hey, are you a Frontier member? If you are, we really appreciate your support. You help our journalists get to the bottom of important issues in Myanmar in difficult reporting environments and even conflict zones. For example, on Friday, we published a feature on illegal logging and deforestation in the Bago mountain range, exposing the involvement of both SAC and resistance forces. This is leading to environmental devastation and fears that the military will use the new logging roads to attack resistance fighters camped in the jungle. So to all our members, thank you. If you're not a member, it's never too late. Join on our website. Now for the final question put to Richard. All right, the last question, it's a big one. I'm going to try and bring this back to the revolution inside Myanmar and the various wars that the military is fighting. So this year we've seen the military seem to take the advantage away from resistance groups in relation specifically to the use of drones. The Kachin Independence Army is now bogged down in Bamor, unable to get around the military's air reinforcements, surveillance drones with night vision, things like that. And dual-use parts for drones that the resistance has relied on, they're getting more expensive and they're harder to get into resistance-held areas. But maybe most importantly, China and Russia appear to have really stepped up their support of the military's drone program with training and advanced technology drone sales. There are forthcoming reports coming up by the Centre on Armed Groups and the Armed Conflict and Location Event Data Project on this topic of the drone arms race. So in your analysis work with Crisis Group, are you noticing the same thing?
So certainly the Myanmar military has been urgently trying to step up its drone capability and drone countermeasure capability for obvious reasons. Drones have really been transformative on the battlefield and at the cost of the Myanmar military. I mean, a lot of its most striking failures on the battlefield have come, at least in part, as a result of significant drone use by its opponents. And this is a kind of a venue where it was not being very successful, right? Its first attempts to go out to the market and buy cheaper drones, more expendable drones, and drone countermeasures failed. They weren't the right equipment, and as Russia itself has been learning in Ukraine, this is a kind of evolutionary Darwinian kind of battle, right? Both sides evolve their drone technology and their countermeasures technology in a very reactive way. Now, the Myanmar military is not well set up to be innovative, reactive, to innovate quickly. And it doesn't have the kind of technical experts that the resistance has access to. Many of the leading technical experts in Myanmar on coding, on all these kind of new technologies, they were private sector young guys in Yangon, part of the tech ecosystem, and many of them left and joined the resistance. And they've helped enormously in terms of getting drone technology up and running and working on the Myanmar battlefield. So Myanmar's been very slow, and it's turned to Russia and China and others for help. Russia had deployed, and I think probably still has, 2 expert drone teams on the ground in Myanmar. One was based in Pa'an, I think one of the other one in northern Myanmar, and that was a possibility for Russian drone experts, not just to provide kit from afar, but to be actually there on the battlefield, observing what was happening, training Myanmar military technicians but also proposing countermeasures and so on. So part of that evolutionary process. And that's been reasonably effective from what we understand. In other words, the Myanmar military has greatly improved its drone capacity and its drone countermeasure capacity. But it's a constant evolution, right? The resistance is also responding to those innovations. And Russia itself has shown that it's not as effective, not as quick as Ukraine is in this space. So it's very significant that Russia is doing this. China has also provided some equipment, but we shouldn't assume from this that the Myanmar military will automatically gain the upper hand.
Okay, no assumptions here. Well, that was a great chat, Richard. Thanks again for coming on the show. See you soon.
Thanks very much, Luke. Good to be on.
Before I sign off, did you know that Frontier has another podcast? It's called relationsAnd, Our Voice, and it produces human rights-related episodes in both Burmese and English languages. The most recent episode, from Tuesday, is about the local heroes left traumatized by their relentless relief efforts to save lives and prevent further tragedy following the 28 March Sagaing earthquake. Get it from our website or on any of your podcast apps. DOHATHAN, relationsAnd. Okay, thanks for keeping up with what's happening in Myanmar for another week. Farewell and take care.